There is a question that psychologists discovered they could ask any adult in the world, and the answer would predict, with striking accuracy, how their romantic relationships would go, not their intelligence, not their childhood income, not even whether they had been hurt before. The question was this: can you tell me about your childhood? Not what happened, not the facts of it, but how you talked about it. Whether the story you told was coherent, whether you could hold the difficult parts and the loving parts in the same sentence and nouns without collapsing into either bitterness or denial. Whether you could say, clearly, this is what happened to me, this is what it cost me, and this is how I understand it now. That quality, the ability to make sense of your own story, turned out to be one of the most powerful predictors of your capacity for love that science has ever identified. More powerful in many studies than whether your childhood was happy. And the reason why is something that researchers spent nearly half a century piecing together. It begins with orphaned children in post-war London. It moves through a laboratory in Baltimore, where mothers and babies were separated for exactly 3 minutes at a time. It passes through brain imaging studies and cortisol measurements and heart rate monitors. And it arrives, ultimately, somewhere very close to home. Tonight, we are going to follow that entire trail together. And along the way, there is a finding I want to hold in reserve for you. Something researchers discovered in the 1970s that completely reframed what it means to appear calm in the middle of emotional distress. Something that, once you hear it, you may not be able to unsee. Take a slow breath. Let your body settle. We have time. Before we can understand attachment theory, we have to understand what people believed before it existed. Because what they believed was so different from what Bowlby ultimately proposed that his ideas were, at the time, genuinely controversial. In the early decades of the 20th century, two powerful frameworks dominated thinking about how infants bonded with their caregivers. The first came from Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalytic tradition. In the Freudian model, a baby loves the person who feeds it. The emotional bond to the mother was understood as a secondary, derived feeling, what psychoanalysts called a secondary drive. The mother was important because she was the source of nourishment. The love, in this view, was essentially gratitude for milk. The second framework gets from behaviorism, the school of psychology that dominated North American academia, particularly from the 1920s through the 1950s. Behaviorists like John B. Watson argued that love between a parent and child was a conditioned response. The mother became associated with warmth, satiation, and comfort over time, and so the infant grew to associate her presence with pleasure. Watson famously and publicly warned parents against too much physical affection on the grounds that it would make children emotionally dependent and prevent them from becoming self-sufficient adults. These frameworks, different as they were, agreed on one thing: the need for closeness was not genuinely primary in the infant. It was a learned preference, built on top of something more basic. Then came the monkeys. In 1958 and 1959, the American psychologist Harry Harlow published what would become some of the most famous experiments in the history of behavioral science. Working with infant rhesus monkeys who had been separated from their biological mothers shortly after birth, Harlow gave each infant a choice between two surrogate mothers placed in its cage. One was made of wire mesh and held a bottle of milk. The other was covered in soft terry cloth and held no food at all. Every prediction that followed from Freudian or behaviorist theory said the same thing. The infant would prefer the wire mother. The milk was what mattered. The warmth was secondary. What Harlow found was the opposite. The infant monkeys spent their days clinging to the cloth mother. They ran to her when frightened. They used her as a base from which to hesitantly explore. They returned to her for comfort. The wire mother, the source of actual nourishment, received barely a fraction of their time. When the cloth mother was removed from the cage, the infants became profoundly distressed. Some rocked. Some clutched themselves. Some never recovered normally. What Harlow demonstrated was that the drive for physical comfort and contact was not secondary. It was not derived from food. It was an independent, primary biological need, one that could override hunger itself in its power to shape behavior and determine psychological well-being. These findings reverberated through the scientific community at exactly the moment when a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby was building a theory that needed precisely this kind of evidence. John Bowlby was born in London in 1907 into an upper-class British family. Like many children of his social class and era, he was raised primarily by nurses and nannies, seeing his parents formally and briefly, rarely with the kind of sustained, warm presence that he would later argue was essential to psychological health. Researchers who have studied his life note carefully, without overreach, that his personal history with distance and separation almost certainly shaped the questions that drove his career. It would be too simple to say his theory was autobiography, but the resonance seems more than coincidental. He trained as a physician at Cambridge, then completed psychoanalytic training, and by the late 1930s was working at the London Child Guidance Clinic with children whose behavioral and emotional difficulties had brought them into professional care. What struck him repeatedly was not the diversity of their problems, but the consistency of one thread running through their histories: interrupted relationships, separations, losses, caregivers who had been absent or unreliable in ways that left marks that no amount of intellectual or behavioral treatment seemed able to fully erase. In 1944, he published a study of 44 young people who had been referred to his clinic, many with histories of petty theft and emotional difficulties. He found a striking concentration of what he called affectionless characters, individuals who seemed genuinely unable to form real emotional connections with others, among those who had experienced prolonged separations from their primary caregivers in early childhood. The link was not universal, and Bowlby was careful not to overstate it, but it was consistent enough to demand explanation. In 1950, the World Health Organization commissioned him to investigate the mental health needs of orphaned and homeless children across Europe and North America in the aftermath of World War II. Bowlby traveled widely, meeting researchers, among them William Goldfarb, whose work with children raised in institutions had documented devastating effects on personality development, social capacity, and emotional regulation. His WHO report, published in 1951 and eventually translated into 14 languages, made a sweeping argument. What children needed was not merely food and shelter, but a warm, continuous, intimate relationship with a consistent caregiver. Without it, the damage was deep and lasting. His theoretical breakthrough came from an unlikely combination of sources. He drew on the evolutionary biology emerging from ethologists like Konrad Lorenz, who had documented how young birds imprint on the first moving figure they encounter after hatching, suggesting that certain kinds of social bonding are not learned but biologically primed. He drew on cybernetics, the science of self-regulating systems, to describe the attachment system as a kind of emotional thermostat, set to maintain closeness when threat was detected, quieting when safety was restored. What he proposed, ultimately, was something that sounds obvious now, but was genuinely radical in its moment. The infant is biologically designed, by the long pressure of evolutionary history, to seek proximity to a protective caregiver when frightened. This seeking is not learned. It is not secondary to feeding. It is a primary biological drive that evolved because, across the long history of human development, infants who stayed close to responsive caregivers were more likely to survive. The attachment system is, at its root, a survival system. He called the experience of using a trusted person as a base of safety the secure base. It was the central organizing concept of his entire framework, and it implied something profound that he was careful to articulate. Safety and exploration are not opposites. The capacity to venture out, to be curious, to take risks, all of this depends on having somewhere solid to return to. Courage grows from security, not from the absence of need. Bowlby laid this theory out across 3 volumes. Attachment in 1969, Separation in 1973, and Loss in 1980. But for all the theoretical power of his framework, one crucial element was missing. His ideas needed measurement. They needed an experiment that could capture individual differences in how children use their caregivers, and test whether those differences mattered. That experiment was coming, and the woman who would design it had already been quietly building the tools for years. Mary Ainsworth was born in Glendale, Ontario in 1913, and by the time she joined Bowlby's research unit in London in the early 1950s, she had already spent years developing her observational skills as a researcher. After 2 years working alongside Bowlby's team, a move abroad took her to Uganda, where between 1954 and 1955, she conducted something extraordinary. Months of careful, repeated home visits to 26 families, with young infants, watching and coding, patiently, meticulously, how babies and their mothers moved together and apart. She noticed things in those Ugandan homes that seemed, at first, almost too subtle to document. Some babies explored with a kind of confident freedom, glancing back at their mothers now and then, but clearly treating them as a reliable anchor for their adventures. When they got hurt or frightened, they moved toward their mother and were quickly comforted. Other infants seemed more uncertain, staying closer to the mother, watching her more intently, easily distressed when she moved out of sight. And then there were the babies, who held themselves apart in ways that read less like independence and more like something harder to name, a kind of practiced distance. When Ainsworth moved to Baltimore and established her own laboratory, she designed the experiment that would turn these observations into science. She called it the Strange Situation Procedure, and it was published in its systematic form in 1978, together with her colleagues Mary Blehar, Everett Waters, and Sally Wall. The procedure was designed to be mildly stressful in a controlled way. An infant between 9 and 18 months was brought into an unfamiliar laboratory room with a caregiver. Over a scripted series of episodes, each lasting approximately 3 minutes, the caregiver and child explored the room together. A stranger entered. The caregiver left. The stranger stayed with the infant, and then the caregiver returned. The sequence was repeated with variations. Researchers observed and coded the infant's behavior throughout, paying particular attention to what happened when the caregiver came back. Those reunion moments were where everything became clear. About 60 to 65% of the infants behaved in a way that Ainsworth called secure. When the caregiver left, they might become upset. There was nothing robotic or unnaturally calm about them. But when the caregiver returned, they moved toward them, sought comfort, and within moments were effectively soothed. They settled. They returned to play. The caregiver's return had genuinely worked. About 15 to 20% of the infants showed a pattern she called anxious ambivalent, or resistant. These infants were often distressed before the caregiver even left, preoccupied with the caregiver's location, reluctant to explore. When the caregiver returned, they approached, but could not settle. They might reach their arms up to be lifted, and then arch their backs in protest. They cried even when held. The alarm, once triggered, would not quiet. The comfort was both sought and refused. And then there was the third group, about 15 to 20%, whom Ainsworth called anxious avoidant. And this is where we arrive at something that stopped researchers in their tracks. These infants appeared, on the surface, remarkably composed. When the caregiver left the room, they did not cry. They continued playing. When the caregiver returned, they turned away slightly, moved toward a toy, or simply continued what they were doing. To anyone watching through the one-way mirror, they would have looked fine, independent, self-sufficient, perhaps even well-adjusted. Ainsworth and her colleague Sylvia Bell had a hypothesis about those apparently unbothered infants. They suspected that the calm on the surface was not real calm, that beneath the quiet behavior, something else was happening. Later researchers, including those who followed up on Ainsworth's work with physiological measures, confirmed it in a way that stopped the field in its tracks. When scientists began measuring the heart rates of avoidant infants during the strange situation, they found something that completely contradicted what their behavior suggested. The avoidant infants' hearts were beating just as fast as the hearts of the openly crying, distressed infants. The physiological alarm was running at the same intensity. The distress was there, just invisible. It had been redirected inward, suppressed, hidden from view. The apparent calm was not calm, it was concealment. And this, the fact that the avoidant child's behavior and their biology were telling entirely different stories, is arguably the most consequential observation in the entire history of attachment research. Because it meant that what looked like emotional ease was, in fact, an enormous, sustained, invisible effort. It raised a question that would take decades of research to answer. How does a baby learn to do that? And what does it cost? To understand the three main attachment styles, secure, anxious, and avoidant, it helps to understand the early caregiving environments that tend to give rise to each of them. Because each style is not a flaw. Each style, as researchers have come to understand it, is a response, an adaptation, a strategy that made sense in the context where it developed. Securely attached. Infants tend to have caregivers who are consistently sensitive and responsive. This does not mean perfect. No caregiver is. But it means that, on balance, the caregiver notices the infant's signals, interprets them with reasonable accuracy, and responds in a way that meets the need. When the infant cries, someone comes. When the infant is frightened, they are soothed. When the infant explores and then looks back, there is a face there, watching. What this consistent experience does, over time, is build what Bowlby called an internal working model, a kind of emotional blueprint laid down before language that shapes the infant's expectations about relationships. The securely attached child's working model contains something along the lines of, "I am worth caring for." Others are reliably available. When I am in distress, reaching out works. These blueprints, as we will see, do not vanish with childhood. They travel forward. The anxious, ambivalent infant, by contrast, tends to have caregivers whose responsiveness is inconsistent. Not absent, the care exists, but it is unreliable. The caregiver may be warm and attentive 1 hour and emotionally unavailable the next, perhaps because of their own stress, depression, preoccupation, or unresolved difficulties. What this creates for the infant is an environment of uncertainty that is, in certain ways, more destabilizing than outright neglect, because the signal is there sometimes. Care arrives sometimes, so the alarm should not be turned off. It must be kept running, amplified, escalated, because maybe this time, if the cry is loud enough, help will come. This is what researchers describe as the hyperactivating strategy. The attachment system is kept in a state of chronic activation because deactivating it feels too risky. The internal working model that develops here tends to carry something like, "I am not sure I am enough. Others are unreliable. I have to work hard to be loved. And I cannot fully trust that love, when it comes, will stay." The avoidant infant is operating from a different lesson entirely. These infants tend to have caregivers who are consistently rejecting of proximity seeking, who pull away when the infant reaches for them, who express impatience or discomfort when the infant cries, who seem most comfortable with the infant when it is quiet and self-contained. This, based on what we know from decades of observation and physiological research, places the infant in an impossible bind. The biological drive is to reach for the caregiver when distressed. But reaching triggers withdrawal. every bid for closeness meets a wall. And so the infant reorganizes. It learns, through repeated experience, that suppressing the outward expression of need keeps the caregiver closer than expressing it does. The attachment system deactivates, not because the need disappears, but because showing the need has been reliably costly. The infant's internal working model develops. Something like, I do not need anyone. I am fine on my own. The feeling of needing is dangerous. But the heart rate, as Ainsworth found, tells a different truth. When these infant patterns grow into adulthood, they tend to express themselves in recognizable, sometimes exquisitely painful ways. Adults who carry what researchers now call anxious attachment, or preoccupied attachment, in the terminology of the adult attachment interview, tend to experience close relationships with a kind of hypervigilance that is both a gift and a burden. Research, including work by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller, has found that anxiously attached individuals can be more accurate than others at detecting subtle shifts in a partner's emotional state. The sensitivity is real. It is a finely tuned social radar, developed in an environment where reading the caregiver's mood was essential. The difficulty is what the radar does with what it detects. Even a small signal of distance, a briefer text, a quieter tone, a canceled plan, can trigger the same deep alarm that separation triggered in infancy. The attachment system, primed for uncertainty, reads ambiguity as danger and responds accordingly. Researchers Mario Mikulincer and Philip Shaver, who have produced some of the most extensive empirical work on adult attachment, describe this as the hyperactivating secondary strategy, an escalation of proximity-seeking behavior designed to close the relational gap and bring the attachment figure back into reliable range. In practice, this can look like repeated texts or calls, sudden emotional escalation over what might seem like small incidents, difficulty being soothed even once reassurance is offered, because the deeper fear is not really about this specific incident. It is about whether love, fundamentally, is reliable. And that question, given the early history, does not have an obvious answer. Physiologically, the anxious attachment style carries a measurable signature. Brain imaging research by Pascal Vertichka and colleagues at the University of Geneva found that, in adults who scored higher on measures of attachment anxiety, the left amygdala showed significantly stronger activation in response to negative social feedback, specifically, angry facial expressions used as signals of social disapproval. The alarm circuitry was running more loudly, triggering faster, in precisely the social situations where the attachment system predicted rejection was most likely. Additionally, research examining cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, has found that anxiously attached individuals tend to show dysregulated cortisol patterns under relational stress, suggesting impaired regulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is not merely psychological. The stress response itself appears to be calibrated differently, likely as a consequence of early caregiving environments that kept the body in a state of prolonged relational uncertainty. What is essential to hold here, and what clinical psychologists consistently emphasize, is that none of this is weakness. The anxiously attached person's nervous system is doing exactly what it learned to do. It is trying to prevent the most terrifying thing it ever experienced, being left and not mattering enough to be returned to. The protest behaviors, the hypervigilance, the difficulty settling, all of it is the surviving echo of a child who learned that love required constant effort to secure. And now, the twist that has been waiting since Section 4. We know that avoidant infants appear calm while their hearts pound. But what happens to that pattern in adulthood? What does a person look like when they have spent their entire life practicing the art of not appearing to need anyone? In the adult literature, avoidant attachment is often called dismissing attachment, a term that captures something important about the cognitive style. Adults with high, Avoidant attachment tend to speak about close relationships as not particularly central to their lives. They may describe preferring independence and solitude. They may be genuinely puzzled by the emotional needs of partners, finding the requests for reassurance or closeness difficult to understand and uncomfortable to provide. They may become irritable or withdrawn when a partner needs significant emotional support. They may describe their own childhoods in oddly flattering terms. Idealized, brief, oddly lacking in specific memory, which researchers have noted is itself a telling sign. Mary Main, who went on to develop the adult attachment interview in the 1980s, made an observation that has been replicated many times. Adults with dismissing attachment often describe their parents as good, or fine, or great, and then, when asked for specific memories to support those descriptions, find themselves unable to provide them, or they provide memories that actually contradict the rosy. Summary: the idealization, researchers believe, may be a continuation of the same cognitive strategy that began in infancy, keeping the attachment system deactivated by minimizing the significance of relational experience, actively excluding painful memories from conscious access. John Bowlby himself called this process defensive exclusion. The key revelation, though, the one that researchers find most compelling, is what happens to avoidant adults physiologically when the suppression system is challenged. Multiple lines of research suggest that while avoidant individuals report lower subjective distress in relational situations, their bodies do not always agree. Under conditions where their habitual deactivating strategies cannot fully operate, in laboratory paradigms that force sustained attention to attachment-relevant material, avoidant individuals sometimes show elevated physiological arousal. One study found that avoidant individuals showed increased amygdala activation to social stimuli during conditions where they were instructed to reappraise, rather than suppress, their emotional responses, as if the suppression strategy, when removed, allowed the underlying distress to surface. The implication here, though the picture is still being refined by ongoing research, is that the avoidant adult is not actually indifferent to closeness. They are, based on what the physiological evidence suggests, managing an ongoing internal cost of suppression. The independence they project may be less a natural disposition and more an elaborate, lifelong, largely automatic performance of not needing, built on top of an infant who discovered that needing was too risky. Researchers describe the deactivating strategy as including characteristic thought patterns, minimizing the importance of a relationship, focusing on a partner's flaws when closeness increases, finding reasons why a particular person is not quite right, becoming absorbed in work, or solitary activities when emotional demands escalate. These are not cruel behaviors. They are a nervous system that learned, before memory, that intimacy is where things go wrong, and has been quietly maintaining that belief ever since. For years, Ainsworth's 3 categories seem to contain the full range of infant attachment experience. But Mary Main, who had been one of Ainsworth's graduate students, kept noticing infants who didn't fit. Infants whose behavior during the strange situation was not organized around any coherent strategy. Infants who, in the reunion moments, would freeze mid-movement and stand perfectly still for several seconds, their expression vacant. Or infants who would walk toward their caregiver and then suddenly veer sideways, or reach their arms up and immediately put them down, or rock in a corner in ways that seemed utterly disconnected from the situation at hand. Working with Judith Solomon, and later with her husband, and research collaborator Eric Hesse, Main formally documented this 4th pattern and published it in 1986 and 1990. They called it disorganized, disoriented attachment, and the explanation they proposed for it is, once you hear it, deeply moving. They theorized something they called fright without solution. Here is the logic. When the attachment system is activated, when the infant is frightened or distressed, the biological imperative is to seek the caregiver. The caregiver is meant to be the solution to fear, the safe haven. the answer to the alarm. But for some infants, the caregiver is also, in some way, a source of the fear. The person the infant is biologically compelled to approach for comfort is the same person whose presence triggers alarm. This is an impossible situation for a nervous system to resolve. Moving toward safety and moving toward danger are the same movement. The infant is caught in what Main and Hesse described as an inescapable approach avoidance conflict, pulled toward the caregiver by the attachment system, and pulled away by fear. And when no behavioral strategy can resolve the conflict, behavior collapses into disorganization. In 1990, Main and Hesse published their hypothesis about the mechanism. They proposed that the caregivers of disorganized infants were often engaging in what they called frightened or frightening behavior, subtle but alarming actions that could include unusual vocal patterns, sudden intrusive movements, expressions of fear, or dissociation in the caregiver's own face, or behavior that simply could not be understood or predicted by the infant. Importantly, they proposed that this frightening behavior was often linked to the caregiver's own unresolved losses or traumas, their own wounds that had never been metabolized, surfacing involuntarily in moments of caregiving. They noted that in one Berkeley sample, 11 of 12 mothers identified with unresolved states of mind regarding loss or trauma had infants who were classified as disorganized. This is an important finding, though Main and Hesse themselves were careful to note that frightened or frightening parental behavior was one significant pathway to disorganized attachment, not necessarily the only one. Research since has added other factors, including parental dissociation, helplessness, and various forms of social and economic adversity. What this means in practice is that disorganized attachment tends to be most prevalent in samples where early caregiving environments included abuse, significant neglect, or a caregiver's own significant unprocessed trauma. And its downstream consequences, in terms of difficulties with emotion regulation, dissociative tendencies, and elevated risk for psychopathology, make it the most clinically significant of the attachment patterns. It is also, perhaps, the one most likely to be transmitted across generations, in the painful cycle where unresolved trauma distorts caregiving, which produces disorganized attachment, which, without intervention, can itself become unresolved trauma in the next generation's adulthood. This is not inevitable. It is interruptible, but it requires understanding. Bowlby always believed that the attachment system did not retire at the end of childhood. He described it as active across the entire lifespan, from what he called the cradle to the grave. But for many years, the empirical research focused almost entirely on infants and children. Adult attachment remained largely theoretical. That changed in 1987, with one of the most influential papers in the history of social psychology. Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver published Romantic Love Conceptualized as an Attachment Process in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Their central argument was simultaneously simple and sweeping. Romantic partners serve the same functional role in adult life that caregivers serve in childhood. They are our safe haven in distress, our secure base for exploration. The people whose responsiveness shapes, from moment to moment, how safe the world feels. And if the same system is operating, then the same individual differences, secure, anxious, avoidant, should be visible in adult romantic relationships. To test this, they developed 3 short paragraphs, each describing a different relationship style, and asked a large community sample of adults to choose the one that best described their experience of close relationships. The secure paragraph described ease with intimacy, comfort with mutual dependence, and freedom from excessive worry about abandonment. The avoidant paragraph described discomfort with closeness and difficulty trusting. The anxious paragraph described the need for greater closeness than partners seem to want, and persistent worry about whether the relationship was truly secure. The distribution of responses matched the strange situation findings with remarkable consistency. Approximately 60% chose the secure description. About 20% chose the avoidant description, and about 20% chose the anxious description. Hazan and Shaver also found that the style adults chose was associated with their memories of their relationships with parents. Secure adults recalled more warmth and affection. Avoidant adults more often recalled parents as cold or rejecting. Anxious adults recalled inconsistency and unpredictability. Subsequent researchers substantially refined and extended the model. Kim Bartholomew in 1990 drew a distinction within avoidance that has proven clinically important. Dismissing avoidance, high avoidance, low anxiety, the pattern that presents as confident independence, and fearful avoidance, high anxiety, characterized by wanting closeness but being too frightened of it to pursue it. Kelly Brennan, Catherine Clark, and Philip Shaver, in work published in 1998, demonstrated that adult attachment was best understood as varying continuously along two independent dimensions, attachment-related anxiety and attachment-related avoidance, rather than fitting neatly into discrete categories. This two-dimensional model now dominates the research literature, allowing much finer-grained measurement of where any individual sits in the attachment landscape. The decades of empirical work that followed have produced a consistent picture. Adult attachment style is associated with relationship satisfaction, conflict patterns, support-seeking behavior, physiological stress responses, and, as we are about to see, measurable differences in the activity of specific brain circuits. Let the breath slow, because what neuroscience has revealed about attachment in the last 2 decades is both precisely technical and, in its implications, genuinely beautiful. The molecule most commonly associated with bonding and social connection is oxytocin, a neuropeptide produced in the hypothalamus and released in the brain and bloodstream during physical touch, caregiving, and close social contact. Research, including a 2009 study by Lane Strathern, Peter Fonagy, and colleagues published in Neuropsychopharmacology, found that securely attached mothers showed significantly stronger brain activation in reward regions and higher oxytocin release in response to their own infant's cues, compared to mothers with insecure attachment. This suggests, at minimum, that secure attachment may be associated with a more readily activated neurobiological reward response to caregiving itself. But oxytocin's role is more complex than popular accounts suggest. Research has found that in individuals with insecure attachment styles, oxytocin administration can sometimes increase anxiety rather than calming it, heightening attention to potentially negative social information rather than promoting trust. Based on what we know about how early experiences shape the neural circuits that oxytocin acts on, this could imply that the meaning the brain assigns to social closeness, whether it reads as safe or as threatening, modulates how oxytocin's effects are expressed. The molecule does not produce trust in a vacuum. It seems to amplify what the social world already feels like. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, has proven to be one of the most revealing structures in attachment neuroscience. In research using functional MRI, Pascal Vertichka and colleagues found that adult participants who scored higher on measures of attachment anxiety showed stronger left amygdala activation in response to angry faces used as social feedback, while those who scored higher on avoidance showed reduced ventral striatal activity in response to positive social feedback. This is a striking double picture. Anxiously attached individuals appear more sensitive to signals of social punishment, while avoidantly attached individuals appear less responsive to social reward. One way to read this pattern, and researchers have proposed interpretations along these lines, is that anxious attachment involves a nervous system calibrated for threat, while avoidant attachment involves one that has learned to mute the reward of closeness. Secure adults, in the same research, showed higher striatal activation to positive social feedback and lower amygdala reactivity to negative social cues, a neural profile consistent with what might be expected from a brain that has learned through consistent early experience, that social connection is more often safe than dangerous. Perhaps most striking is what cortisol research suggests about the cost of avoidant suppression. Multiple studies have found that avoidant individuals report lower subjective distress in relational situations. But their cortisol profiles, and in some studies their skin conductance and cardiovascular measures, suggest ongoing physiological activation that does not match what they report experiencing. Interpretation of this pattern, consistent with what we understand about defensive exclusion, is that suppression of attachment-related distress is not the same as the absence of that distress. The body may be keeping a record that the conscious mind is not allowed to access. This is not a metaphor. It is measurable. And now we arrive at what may be the most important thing said tonight. Here is the reveal that changes the entire picture. Mary Main, who developed the adult attachment interview in the 1980s, was primarily interested in predicting infants' attachment classifications from the attachment representations of their parents. What she and her colleagues found, when they analyzed thousands of interview transcripts, was that the most powerful predictor of a parent's attachment classification was not what their childhood contained. It was how they told the story of it. Parents who had had genuinely difficult childhoods, abuse, neglect, loss, inconsistent care, could, nonetheless, produce what researchers classified as secure or autonomous interview transcripts, not because they minimized what happened, but because they had made sense of it. They could speak about painful experiences with coherence and integration, without collapsing into bitterness, idealization, or unresolved grief. They could hold complexity. They could say, "This was hard. This was my parents' limitation. And this is how I understand it now." And parents with this quality of narrative coherence, regardless of whether their childhoods were happy, tended to raise securely attached infants. This is the finding that changes everything. Because what it means is that the pathway to secure attachment in the next generation does not require a happy past. It requires a processed one. It requires making sense of your own story. This concept, the adult who demonstrates secure attachment despite having had an insecure childhood, has been given a specific name in the SIT research literature: earned security. Studies using the adult attachment interview have found that earned secure individuals represent roughly 8 to 20% of those who classify as secure in adult samples. They show the same coherence of narrative, the same flexibility of emotional regulation, the same comfort with intimacy and interdependence, achieved not through an easy early life, but through the difficult, sustained work of understanding the one they actually had. What creates earned security? The research suggests several pathways. Longitudinal work by Fraley, Roisman, and colleagues, following more than 700 individuals from infancy through young adulthood, found that early attachment security was genuinely predictive of later outcomes, but not determinative. Life experiences continued to matter. A consistent, warm, romantic relationship could begin to revise internal working models built in early childhood. A meaningful friendship that provided the experience of being reliably known and valued. A therapeutic relationship that offered, slowly, carefully, over time, the experience of being consistently held. The therapeutic relationship itself has been studied extensively as a vehicle for earned security. Research suggests that when clients develop a secure attachment to their therapist, when the therapeutic relationship itself becomes a consistent, emotionally responsive experience, this can create what researchers call a corrective emotional experience, gradually revising expectations about intimacy that were formed long before there were words for them. Emotionally focused therapy, developed in the 1980s by Leslie Greenberg and Sue Johnson, has shown particularly strong evidence for this process in couples by helping partners understand each other's attachment behavior and experience new emotional moments within the relationship itself. Attachment-based family therapy has been listed on multiple national and international evidence-based registries for treating adolescent depression and suicidality. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing has shown promise for addressing attachment wounds rooted in early trauma. But formal therapy is not the only route. Studies suggest that approximately 30 to 50% of individuals show meaningful shifts in attachment orientation over time through the quiet accumulation of relational experiences that contradict old expectations. Being chosen consistently, being stayed with through difficulty, being responded to when asking for help, being surprised repeatedly by someone's reliability. These experiences do not erase early history, but they do, slowly and measurably, revise the internal working model built from it. The brain is not finished. The story is not over. The patterns formed in infancy were built by experience, and they can, with time and the right relational conditions, be rebuilt by it. Attachment is not confined to romantic love. It shows up wherever the need for connection, safety, and care is present, which is to say, nearly everywhere. In friendships, the patterns are recognizable. Anxiously attached people may place intense reliance on particular friendships, may feel quickly rejected by even small shifts in availability, may read distance as a personal statement rather than a circumstance. Avoidantly attached people may maintain warm but carefully bounded friendships, generous in surface ways, but reluctant to be known fully, quick to feel crowded when closeness deepens. Securely attached people tend to form friendships that feel spacious, capable of surviving separation without catastrophizing, capable of genuine mutual support during difficulty. In professional environments, attachment patterns emerge in how people respond to feedback, relate to authority, handle evaluation. Research has even found correlations between attachment style and leadership behavior, with secure leaders tending to foster more trust, encourage more open dialogue, and create conditions in which the people they lead feel safe enough to take risks and speak honestly. This may reflect the same dynamic that operates between caregiver and infant. When the attachment figure is reliably available and responsive, exploration, intellectual, creative, relational, becomes possible in ways it is not when the attachment system is chronically activated by threat. But perhaps the most consequential domain is parenting. In a comprehensive meta-analysis published in 1995, Marinus van Isendorn examined 661 mother-infant pairs across 13 studies and found that 75% of mother-infant pairs showed matching classifications on the broad dimension of secure versus insecure attachment. The parent's state of mind regarding attachment, assessed through the adult attachment interview, which analyzed the coherence and integration of their narrative about their own childhood, predicted the infant's attachment pattern in the strange situation. It is worth noting that when the classification system was extended to 4 categories, the agreement rate dropped to approximately 63%, suggesting that while the transmission effect is robust, it is not perfectly predictive, and other factors continue to shape the outcome. The striking implication is that what passed from parent to infant was not the content of the parent's childhood experience, whether it was happy or difficult, but the relationship the parent had developed with their own history. The parents who had processed their past, who could speak about it with coherence and nuance, were more likely to be sensitive and responsive caregivers. The parents who remained caught in unresolved loss or trauma, or who defensively dismissed the significance of their early experiences, were more likely to transmit insecurity, not through deliberate choices, but through the 1,000 small moments of attunement or missed attunement that constitute the daily fabric of caregiving. What this suggests, and it is both one of the most sobering and most hopeful findings in all of developmental science, is that the most powerful thing any parent can do for their child may not require financial resources, specialized knowledge, or a calm external life. It may, above all, require understanding, the willingness to sit with one's own history, to make sense of it, to know where it still hurts and why, and to bring that understanding, rather than its unprocessed residue, into relationship with the child. This is why the science of attachment ultimately converges with something that looks a great deal like therapy, with narrative, with the slow, sometimes painful work of learning to tell your own story with honesty and compassion. It is late now, or it is quiet, or the world outside has gone still in the way it sometimes does, and there is nothing required of you for the next few hours except rest. Before you drift, I want to leave you with something. We began tonight with a question about how you talk about your childhood, and now, having traveled through everything, through the evolutionary biology, through Ainsworth's laboratory, through the heart rate monitors, and the brain scans, and the reunions that went right, and the ones that didn't, I hope that question means something different than it did at the start. Because here is what attachment theory ultimately says about human beings. Beneath all the categories and the research, we came into the world already oriented toward love, already primed to seek a face, a voice, the particular warmth of someone who would stay. Whatever happened in those early years, whether we were met with consistency or inconsistency, with warmth or with distance, or with something more frightening than either, we learned something. We built a blueprint of the world and of ourselves inside it. We developed a strategy that was, in its moment, genuinely intelligent. The anxious attachment pattern is the strategy of a person who learned, early and correctly, that love was present but uncertain, and responded by staying alert. The avoidant pattern is the strategy of a person who learned that showing need was too costly, and responded by building a life that appeared not to need. Even the most difficult patterns were, once, the most brilliant option available. That reframe, recognizing the pattern not as a flaw, but as the most sophisticated response your younger self could construct, is not merely kindness. Researchers suggest it may be, in fact, the precise mechanism by which change begins. Because earned security, as we have seen, grows from exactly this: making sense of the past. Looking at what happened and saying, with clarity and without self-destruction, I understand now. I understand what I learned and why I learned it and what it has cost. And I am ready, slowly and imperfectly, to learn something new. Patterns that feel most fixed in us are not fixed because they are who we are. They are fixed because they were formed before we could question them, in a place we cannot consciously remember, by experiences we had no language for. They feel like self, but they are, at their root, a response. And responses, with the right conditions, a safe relationship, a therapeutic space, the repeated surprise of someone being more reliable than we expected, can change. Not all at once, not without effort and discomfort and setbacks, but genuinely, measurably, verifiably, they can change. You do not need to have had a perfect childhood to become someone capable of deep, secure love. You need, above all, to begin telling the story of the one you had, with honesty, with curiosity, and perhaps, eventually, with just a little more compassion than you have offered yourself before. That is where the work is, and it is some of the most worthwhile work there is. If tonight's journey has been useful to you, if something here found you where you needed to be found, please consider leaving a like. It is a quiet thing, but it reaches other people who might be lying awake asking similar questions. And if you would like to be here next time, a subscription costs you nothing and means a great deal. Sleep well. You are safe here, and you have everything you need to begin.